Happy winter solstice! I thought I'd create this little video for you to provide some further background on the significance of this annual event, which can accurately be understood as the natural New Year. This is an ancient celebration, of course, and cross-culturally, all over the world, people throughout the ages have observed this special moment as, on a very practical level, the calendrical anchor to the year. It's like the moment when the new year begins in the natural cycle of things. So in ancient times, ceremonial stages were set, like Stonehenge and like caverns like this, that were particularly oriented to capture that very moment when solstice would occur, and they would know what the day was. It was very practical in that regard. And but it also, of course, took on spiritual overtones throughout the ages. Symbolically linked to cycles, winter solstice represents the eternal renewal principle and can be stretched to be understood as the resurrection, because it's the day where there's the shortest hours of daylight in the Northern Hemisphere. We have this resurrection principle because from here on, leading up to summer solstice, the hours of daylight get longer. So there's a symbolic significance here, and it does extend itself also to the principle of reincarnation. There's a rebirth of the cycle, is a basic way of saying it, and it applies in many other directions. In a sort of a graphic sense, we get this clear illustration that from the perspective of Earth, we see the sun at different heights in the sky at different times of the year, and winter solstice is when it's at the lowest, summer solstice is when it's at the highest, and the equinoxes are equal on both sides. Both spring and autumn equinox show the sun from our perspective at the midpoint in the sky in respect to the lower, which is winter, and the upper, which is summer solstice. And of course, the solstices and equinoxes are the mark points for the official beginning of each season. So we have the seasonal round, and it's also important to note that the seasons correspond directly to the elements, the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. So we get that correspondence directly as well. Now, it's not so commonly known that the phases of the moon are directly tied into that natural cycle, but it is true. Symbolically, there's a wonderful correspondence, which I'll clarify even further in a moment. This tool here is what's called a moon phase mandala, and you'll notice at the top here it says winter solstice and new moon. They share a close parallel correspondence, and this unfolds as a series of 8 phases which have a very specific timeline. So when you divide a cycle according to the model of the waxing moon, which is in direct relationship therefore to the sun, you have these very specific turning points, or what would be called, each phase is like a pocket of time. So in your astrology, when the one phase transitions to the next, you'll experience some synchronistic shift in your life, and it'll be subtle sometimes, but sometimes not. But when it's pointed out, yes, it's recognized that yes, there was a sort of a shift at that time, and again, sometimes more clearly, deliberately, there was some event that occurred to push us, especially if we're resisting the flow of our growth and the destiny of our evolutionary journey, because that's the way our subconscious mind works. It's very closely tied in with these natural cycles, and that's basically, in a nutshell, how astrology works. So you get this waxing principle of the moon. So winter solstice is the new moon. The first quarter moon represents spring equinox, and the half moon and the full moon would correspond to summer solstice, and it goes like that. And so you have these little thematic descriptions of what it's like during each phase as well. So I use this tool all the time when I do astrology readings. So this is more graphic, more literal depiction of these correspondences. So these symbolic parallels of the waxing and waning moon over 8 phases can basically be divided into 4 principal phases, with winter solstice representing new moon and equaling a solar eclipse, 12 midnight, and the conjunction aspect in astrology. Yes, they all directly symbolically correspond to one another. Then there's spring equinox with its waxing first quarter moon, that's the half moon in the sky, which equals 6 a.m. and applies to what's called the lower square. Then there's summer solstice, which equates to full moon, lunar eclipse, 12 noon, and the opposition aspect. Then finally there's autumn equinox, which equates to the last quarter moon, the half moon in its waning phase, and 6 p.m. and what's called the upper square. I won't go ahead and get too much into the details about those lower and upper squares, but it's just an understanding that you have during the waxing of any transit planet in relationship to another, there's a lower side, and when it comes into opposition, it then begins the upper phase. So that you have aspects that can be lower or upper. It's rather an interesting and important understanding to have. But let's get back to winter solstice. So there you go, a little bit of background initially just to provide an indication that, of course, astrology is very much about astronomy brought down to earth and applied to the affairs of everyday life. And that's why also clocks and calendars can actually accurately be understood as astrological devices. It's rather interesting to note because it's all about the meaning of the relationship between us here on earth and the celestial sphere, which most immediately includes the sun and moon. So the solstice event then shows this special moment in which again the henges in the world mark and depict at a very specific angle and becomes the calendar in stone. That's what a henge can be best understood as. Now, taking this just a little bit deeper to a more esoteric level, the sun in the sky can be understood as a focal point of spiritual or divine power. To think that the sun is merely an object in the sky is quite missing the point. So when we understand it at a more spiritual level, we understand that it's a focal point in the cosmos, as is true of every sun or star in the entire galaxy and anywhere in the universe. The star, which would be the sun to the planet and hypothetically the sentient beings who live on that planet, would be the life giver. So that's why it has this divine theme behind it. But it gets even more interesting when you get into the esoteric story behind it. And you begin to understand that it's not just an emotional, sentimental, or kind of belief-driven thing to realize that the sun actually has a kind of a being essence in it. And it has a consciousness and is a creative force with intelligence, and is also intentional and purposeful. Wow. So you begin to move beyond the modern notion of objectifying things that makes the sun not a living being, which it more accurately is in this more esoteric understanding, and it becomes more of an object. It becomes a thing. And this thing, which is the giver of life on the planet, in a more literal sense, is kind of demoted from the position it should hold in many respects. So we become very kind of linear in our thinking, and that's been the result ever since the emergence of the scientific revolution. And it's taken time, but we've arrived at a place where it seems that while that has been true, we've been very linear and logical and so forth. We're returning now to a place where we feel, I think, many people, that something's missing. And there's this sort of unconscious search or return to be back in alignment with nature. And this does include the sun and, in a larger sense, astrology itself. Now, we also, I'm going to back up there one more time. There's also this kind of image here that shows up that shares the idea that the sun in its creative process can be understood in this depiction, which illustrates the step down process of the Vesica Pisces, which is a circle or a sphere where it enters into what would be, graphically described as a cell mitosis process, a division of the one into the two, which then becomes the three. And then it eventually emerges into the flower of life, which is the beautiful and mystical image or shape from which all sacred geometrical shapes emerge. So that's a very interesting esoteric little peek. It's the tip of the iceberg, what I just said, but it's all true in principle, that there's this mystical transference of intelligence that is where we get into a deeper understanding of both sacred geometry and also higher dimensional reality, which includes the design or plan principle behind the outer manifestation of life. Now, this does extend itself also into what would be a more, again, dimensional perspective, where we can think of evolution, but we can also think of involution. Involution is where the spirit it culminates or enters into its creative process and then manifests in the physical sense. We tend to think kind of somewhat the other way, especially with our human egos. We forget that we are the final result of a many layered creative process, which invariably must be intelligent. It has conscious, intentional, purposeful activity, because if it wasn't for that conscious, intentional, purposeful, creative energy, we wouldn't function the way we do. So it's kind of a given when you get really close to it. There's nothing random or arbitrary about it, but that has been the position and continues in some respects to be the position of more what's generally referred to as academia, which definitely draws some attention to the limitations of a staunch, linear, scientifically driven academic education, even because it has it takes a position of asserting a final authority, but it's only a model of perspective on reality. So there's a whole involution as well as evolution principle, and that's where we go into a deductive logic and begin to understand that, wow, the divine creative impulse goes through many layers of dimensional reality, and it finally manifests on the material plane as the object and the finally the objectified world that we experience. But when we return back to its subjective essence and source, it again becomes more of a mystical, spiritual, divine reality that we begin to understand. And this is why historically and traditionally we have religions which celebrate the various orientations or designations of the sun as beings. So as a being, I should say, like Sol or Helios, Surya, Ra. They're all names most people have heard. At least Sol and Ra and Helios. Surya is less known, but that does also refer to the sun in the Sanskrit language. And so it's the sun by any other name, but it's given a name because it's seen more as a being, a life-giving entity, as opposed to just an object, which is, an over-objectification of the left linear brain. So now the sun itself, being as a being, also in its long life does have a birth and a life and a death moment, which we generally have heard about. So that's something to be just added to the notion of it being a living being. But that is conscious, intelligent, and a spiritual being takes it to a whole new level. And it does also, in this regard, when we dive deeper into this mystical, esoteric understanding, it becomes mysterious, mystical, and ultimately magical when we see the final results. These aren't the best words, they're not the only words, but they work very well at the end of the scale, because what words would you choose? And all of the above can be placed under the heading and understanding of what's called the solar logos. The solar logos means that the sun is an intelligent, creative, spiritual being with intentional, purposeful function as a part of a larger cosmic reality, and that larger cosmic reality invariably becomes multidimensional. So this is where you start to really understand that there's this spiritual science and understanding of the processes of nature that erase the idea of a random arbitrary principle once again, which is a highly reductionistic thinking model. So you get into this wonderful celebration of the purpose of life, and you can really own that and really take that to heart and bring it home in your own being and life to recognize that you are a spiritual being with purpose, intention, and so on, and you can therefore anchor into your spiritual purpose as a part of a larger evolutionary designed reality that life is. Okay, so this is where we get into this wonderful realization that it's all by intentional, purposeful, creative, intelligent design, all of which can be placed under the larger heading of consciousness, with what would be called a plan or a purpose, which has intention. And at the highest level, we get into the notion of a God or a divine intelligence that is behind it all. Now, it is also quite scientifically understood that everything in the physical world, at least, is an adaptation of solar energy. So everything has solar energy in it. The sun truly is in the material sense, but with a spiritual essence as well, as just explained, the sun very much is the giver of life. And the entire solar system is 99.99% the sun. And in fact, it should be well understood that we actually live in the expanded body of the sun. So when we see the sun in the sky, what we're basically looking at can be described as the nucleus of the sun, and we live in its expanded body, which extends well beyond the farthest planet in the solar system. So let's just say we were talking about Pluto, which would be about 1/3 out the full distance of the extent of the sun's solar field. So the sun's extended solar field extends out for what would be 1 day at the speed of light, and that achieves the entire expanded body of the sun. And so the entire solar system is within that body, and that certainly includes us. So everything that's within that body, therefore, is a part of it. It's like a cosmic cell the entire solar system can be understood like a cosmic cell, and everything within it has an intelligence, a purpose, a function, and variably is a part of a larger design, a larger plan. So it gets really quite mystical and interesting at this moment. So when we think of the sun at the center of the solar system, which it accurately is, we can recognize that there's planets and orbiting the sun, and here you see all of the planets, and among them here's the sun and moon. So we have that principle as well, and it's very valid to look at it that way. So what's important at this level is that we're seeing the sun from our perspective, and there's the planets in the solar system by just an illustrated model here, not the exact way. But the fact of the matter is interesting that we live on the planet, so our experience of the sun places it in the sky and in actually an approximate similar size to the moon. So there's a whole story from that perspective, which brings us into the picture. You see, you can't remove the observer, the experience, from the experiment, so we are reminded that we are very intrinsically a feature both of nature itself, but also that we are a participant with our perceptual faculty of mind as we observe the sun and moon and all the planets hovering or cycling around us. We begin to see that we are actually engaged in a co-creative process. It's not just simply a subject-object situation. It's much more intrinsic than that. And this word intrinsic can also be understood as communion, that we're in a communion of consciousness, that there is no separation really. It's just a continuum of layers and levels transitioning from one to the other. Yes, we can think of a cell as a whole thing, a whole cell, and we can think of each and every one of us as having a whole body, and we live on a whole planet in a whole solar system. So this is the basic model of holism. But what's woven within that is the realization that we don't simply exist in nature, but that we are nature. We are extensions of it. And in that regard, in that intrinsic communion sort of level of being where there's no true division, even though perceptually we do experience, in our environment, this like things around us and so forth. But when you get closer to it, you realize that it's a grand continuum of oneness, and that would be true certainly if we get into the quantum physics of it and so on. Now, in this regard, we are co-creators, and this is an indication that the function of our whole mind, meaning not just our conscious mind, our conscious and our subconscious mind, includes the weave and the co-creative elements of our beliefs, our perceptions and interpretations, all of which, it is true, are conditioned and subject to the steady flow of time and change. So when we understand this steady flow of time and change, and we understand that there's this ongoing process of life, we also realize that we, in our co-creative capacity, have the opportunity to engage, which is already happening intrinsically, but we can choose with our free will to engage more consciously and deliberately, and that can be understood to begin with our perceptions and interpretations, and which generally include our beliefs, which are better often understood as much as assumptions or biases. Okay, so these aren't negative, but it is good to know that we operate with bias and belief, which frames our perceptions and our interpretations, and in a co-creative sense we can choose to change them. That was very ideal, and especially ideal if in changing them we're more in alignment with our true nature. And that's the idea behind astrology, by the way. So in the fullness of our being, when we kind of get to a deeper layer of who we are, we realize that we're not just these objects, we're not just these separate physical bodies and so forth. There's more going on, and that's where we get into the notion of esotericism. What's going on in there, and what are the layers of reality behind the outer creation? That kind of thing is what we start to experience. So now this is where also we get into the chakra principle, and the idea that the chakras are etheric counterparts within the layers of our dimensional embodiment, and I basically refer to them as the 7-prong plug that plugs us into existence. It's an interesting way of looking at it. Now, once we start getting closer to this understanding, we enter into what's called spiritual science. The spiritual science of things takes this mystical understanding and starts to apply it, but mystical science, spiritual science, tends to do it in a much more sacred geometrical way. It sees it as a more harmonized principle of shape having been formed by sound, which brings us back full circle, by the way, to the solar logos mentioned earlier. So we get into this cosmic, metaphysical, spiritual science reality, which includes sacred geometry and cycles and cosmic realities and multidimensionality and the chakras, etc. We can start to see them as all part of a larger embodiment principle, which can be described certainly as a highly complex, highly sophisticated reality. But it gets even more interesting when we realize that we're sentient, conscious beings, and it's all purposeful. And so it starts becoming quite interesting, and we can get out of our kind of blasé minds about who we are and why we are and what are we going to have for dinner, as important as these things are. We get into a deeper consideration of ourselves and of life in a general sense, and that can prove very humbling on one hand, but very inspiring on the other. And then when we understand that there's this purpose, this plan, this rhyme and reason, time and season model, we can learn to tune into it. We can learn to realize that there's a conscious opportunity to engage more fully. So this is now, when we bring it all down, this is where we come to what would be our astrology. And this geocentric model perspective here reveals the Earth at the center of the solar system, of course, and it also reveals the fact that the planets appear to be orbiting around us, and this is how we translate this finally into what becomes an astrology chart, which is a symbolic depiction of what image you just saw previously, with the Earth at the center. Even though we know the Sun is at the center of the solar system, it's the Earth that we live on, so it's experienced from the geocentric perspective. So there you go. Behind this whole celebration of the winter solstice is the Sun-Earth relationship. And when you really start to dig down in there, you start getting into this whole reality of relationship in a terrestrial, earth-based sense, transitioning to a celestial or, cosmic sense. And then we begin to weave the two together. You understand increasingly that there's layers of reality, which we call dimensional layers, that are woven within the entire model. And that's where we come full circle to understand that, wow, behind the winter solstice is a whole other dimensional perspective that we don't usually think of. And often, it's given to a kind of a pagan, traditional focus. But when we start to really understand the deeper implications behind just observing the relationship between the sun and the moon, and especially when we bring in the different realities of things like astrology, and we realize that it can symbolically decode into this deeper intentional, creative, purposeful design of reality, we can come to realize that, oh my God, we do in fact live in a conscious universe. There is in fact a creative source. Our life is in fact on purpose, and that kind of wisdom and knowledge that's shared when your astrology chart is interpreted well becomes very evident to you that it's accurate, that it's true. Even in some respects, actually, the map that astrology is can know you or see things about you better than you or yourself are aware of. And that, in that regard, it can prove very awakening, very inspirational, very empowering, and it can help you make more conscious choices to be in alignment with it. And that, in a simple sense, is the, deeper rhyme and reason behind the astrology, and again, which finds its anchor point in the cycle of the Sun-Earth relationship, which results every year as a new cycle at winter solstice.